My grandchildren told me, "Sign these papers and you won't have any problems." But the truth was they wanted to take the railroad my husband and I had built all our lives. What they didn't know was that I had an ace up my sleeve they never saw coming. I was born in the summer of 1952, back when milk was still delivered in glass bottles and the train whistle was the soundtrack of every small town. My father worked the yards, and my earliest memories are of him coming home with soot on his face, the smell of iron and grease clinging to his coat. My mother scrubbed those shirts in a tin basin out back, but that smell never left. Settled into me too, I suppose. By the time other girls were playing with dolls, I was drawing tracks in the dirt, laying twigs and pebbles for miniature trains I imagined roaring through. I didn't set out to become an engineer, not at first. Girls in the 50s were steered toward teaching, nursing, or homemaking. But I had a stubborn streak, and by the time I was 16, I was sneaking into the roundhouse with a notebook, sketching locomotives while the men shook their heads. "That Walker girl," they'd say, "always got grease under her nails." I wore it like a badge. I worked my way through school, first in drafting, then in civil engineering. It wasn't easy being one of the only women in a field full of men who thought I was either a secretary or a novelty. But I kept at it, working summers on survey crews, stomping through swamps with a tripod taller than me, and freezing my fingers on steel bridges in December. I loved every second. To me, rails were more than steel. They were veins of a living country, carrying people and possibility from one shore to the other. When I was 24, I met Thomas, my husband. He wasn't a railway man. He was an accountant. Calm, patient, the kind of fellow who balanced me out. Where I saw dreams in steel and steam, he saw the ledgers that made it all possible. We married in 1976, and though money was tight, we built a life steady as a timetable. We raised 2 boys, and while Thomas handled the numbers, I kept working. By the late 70s and 80s, I was leading infrastructure projects, helping design routes that opened up forgotten towns, connecting factories to ports, laying the bones of commerce under America's skin. For decades, my life was measured in blueprints, in miles of track, in the rumble of engines. I wasn't famous, but my fingerprints are on more bridges and crossings than most folks will ever know. It gave me a quiet pride, even as my hair went silver and my hands stiffened with age. Then came the call that changed everything. In 2015, after 40 years of marriage, Thomas was diagnosed with cancer. He fought it bravely, but by 2018 he was gone. I don't think anyone is ever ready for that silence. The kind that presses in after the last machine is shut off, after the house is empty but still smells like his aftershave. I kept his chair by the window untouched for nearly a year, as though he might walk in and sit down. When he passed, I learned he had left me something unexpected. Thomas, cautious man that he was, had quietly invested in the railway company I'd worked alongside for decades. He left me not just our home and savings but a stake, 30% ownership, in that company. At the time it was valued around $220 million. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, papers spread before me, hands trembling. I wasn't some Wall Street widow. I was just an engineer with bad knees and a heart full of grief. But Thomas, God bless him, had believed in me, in my life's work, even when I didn't see it myself. So there I was at 73, alone for the first time in decades, with grown grandchildren and a fortune I never expected. People looked at me differently after that, neighbors, friends, even family. Some saw me as comfortable, some as a prize to be handled. But I still saw myself as the girl tracing railroad lines in the dirt, stubborn as ever, still carrying the smell of steel in my memory. I didn't yet know the storm my own kin would bring down on me. I didn't know that love and loyalty could be signed away as quickly as a name on a piece of paper. All I knew then was this. My life had been built on rails, on strength, on keeping things moving forward. And though grief had slowed me, it hadn't stopped me. Not yet. It started so innocently, or at least it seemed to. My grandchildren were always polite, sometimes even affectionate, though in the way busy young people are, half distracted, more glued to their phones than to the sound of my voice. I tried not to take it personally. Life is fast now. But after Thomas passed and the news spread about my share in the railway company, their attention sharpened. Dinners, calls, visits, they came with a new urgency. Suddenly, Grandma wasn't just someone with stories and pie recipes. I was an asset. It began with Gregory, my oldest grandson. He's 32, handsome in a slippery sort of way, always wearing a suit a little too sharp for the occasion. He sat across from me one Sunday afternoon, sipping coffee like he owned the house. "Grandma," he said, "we just want to help. You've carried so much on your shoulders. Managing these shares, the meetings, the paperwork, it's too much. Let us take care of it." I smiled politely, though my stomach turned. "I've managed engineering contracts for bridges longer than you've been alive, Gregory. I can handle a shareholder meeting." He laughed, that slick laugh that never reaches the eyes. "Of course you can, but why bother? We'll handle the details. You just enjoy your life. Travel. Relax. Don't you want peace of mind?" Peace of mind. As if I hadn't fought for every bit of peace I owned. A week later, my granddaughter Emily visited, her children in tow. She put the papers right on the kitchen table, beside the plate of lemon cookies I had baked. "They're just updated forms, Grandma," she said sweetly. "Legal stuff. Makes it easier for the board to process everything. We'll keep you informed, of course. Nothing changes for you. You'll still get the dividends. We just want to streamline things." Her children were tugging at my curtains, spilling juice on the rug, while she slid those pages closer to me, a pen already uncapped. It all felt rehearsed, like they'd drawn straws to see who would charm me best. I didn't sign that day. I told her I needed time, needed to read. She frowned but didn't push. 2 nights later, though, Gregory and Emily both came back, together this time. They brought wine, flattered me, filled the house with noise and warmth. "Grandma," they said, "we love you. We'd never let anything happen to you. Just sign these, it's routine. Every shareholder does it." I don't know if it was grief still fogging my mind, or the way they looked at me, expectant and kind on the surface. Or maybe it was the loneliness, the yearning to believe my family truly wanted to carry me, not strip me. My hand shook, but I signed. When I set the pen down, Gregory patted my shoulder. Emily kissed my cheek. "You won't regret it," she said. But something in her voice made me shiver. Later that night, sitting alone in my armchair, I stared at the copy they'd left. The words blurred together, a sea of clauses and legal jargon. I tried to read, but my eyes wouldn't hold steady. All I could think was of Thomas. He'd trusted me with numbers, with documents. He'd believed I was sharp enough to handle anything. And yet there I was, feeling like a child who had just signed away her allowance. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. No calls, no visits. I told myself they were busy, but something gnawed at me. I called Gregory once, left a message. No reply. Emily sent a short text. "All good, Grandma. Don't worry." But worry I did. I sat at the dining room table, the same table where Thomas and I had pored over bills and plans for decades. The documents lay before me again. The ink of my name like a brand across the page. I traced it with my finger, a pit growing in my stomach. Was it love they offered me, or just a mask to hide their hunger? I'd find out soon enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday mornings were always quiet in my neighborhood. The garbage trucks had already passed, the children were at school, and the only sound was the soft hum of my kettle on the stove. I was at the table, buttering toast, when I heard the envelope slide through the mail slot. It looked ordinary enough, cream-colored with the bank's emblem stamped in navy blue. But my hands trembled before I even opened it. Something in me knew. Inside was a letter, short, sharp, merciless. Dear Mrs. Walker, this is to inform you that effective immediately, your accounts and associated dividends have been frozen, pending restructuring proceedings related to Walker Rail Holdings. As of this date, your role is designated as passive shareholder with no rights of management or distribution. I read the words once, then again, then a third time as if repetition might rearrange them into something kinder. But the meaning was clear. On paper, I was no longer the co-owner Thomas had intended me to be. I was nothing but a name on a ledger, stripped of voice, stripped of power. I sat there frozen, the butter knife still in my hand, its edge sinking into the toast. My tea had gone cold by the time the truth reached me fully. They had done it. My own grandchildren. I called the bank, of course. After 40 minutes of transfers and polite voices, a woman finally confirmed what the letter said. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker. The board approved the filing. You signed the authorizations yourself. Her words sliced deeper than the letter had. You signed it yourself. I thanked her, though my voice cracked. After I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the photographs on my wall. Thomas in his glasses, smiling faintly as he always did when I insisted he stand for a picture. Our sons as boys, mud up to their knees after one of our camping trips. My grandchildren at Christmas years ago, cheeks sticky with candy canes, eyes wide with trust. And now? Now those same hands that once reached for cookies in my kitchen had pushed a pen into mine and taken everything. I felt the room close in. The walls that had once been my refuge seemed to lean over me, whispering accusations. Fool. Naive. You should have known better. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked the house in circles, my slippers soft on the worn rugs, the sound of the clock ticking louder than my own heartbeat. I pulled out Thomas's old briefcase from the closet, the one with the cracked leather handle. Inside were folders, receipts, scraps of our life together. He had trusted me with so much. I whispered into the empty room. I'm sorry, Thomas. I failed. The next morning I called Gregory. No answer. I tried Emily. Straight to voicemail. Hours later a text came back from her. Grandma, don't stress. Everything's under control. We're just modernizing things. You'll see. Trust us. Trust us. I deleted the message without replying. The days that followed were a blur of calls, letters, and doors quietly closing in my face. My lawyer, the one who had handled Thomas's estate, told me bluntly, if you sign those papers, it will be very difficult to contest. Unless there's proof of fraud or coercion, the court will side with the documents. Fraud. Coercion. Words too sharp to fit easily into my mouth. And yet, wasn't that exactly what had happened? Smiles and sweet words covering the trap. I tried to tell myself money didn't matter. That I was 73, with a modest home and enough savings to live comfortably. But it wasn't the money. It was the principle. It was Thomas's legacy, our life's work, stripped from me with a flick of a pen. On the third night, I sat in the darkened living room, only the glow of the street lamp outside spilling through the blinds. My eyes wandered to the bookshelf in the corner, the one sagging under decades of blueprints, journals, and maps from my career. I hadn't opened those drawers in years. They were relics, I thought, souvenirs of a younger woman's fight. But something stirred in me then. A question. A whisper. What if the past still mattered? What if those old lines and routes weren't as forgotten as I believed? I pushed the thought aside at first. Too fanciful, too desperate. But it lingered like the hum of a train on distant tracks. By morning, when the kettle whistled and the mail slot clinked again, I knew this wasn't just about shock anymore. It was about survival. And I would not go down quietly. The night after that letter, I couldn't rest. My thoughts clattered in my head like loose bolts on a rail line. I moved from room to room, unable to sit still. Finally, I found myself in the library. It wasn't much of a library, really. Just the old den Thomas and I had converted into shelves and filing cabinets. The air in there always smelled faintly of paper and dust, mixed with the cedar from the wooden walls. I hadn't spent much time inside since Thomas passed, except to dust or straighten a pile. But that night I felt drawn in, as though something was waiting for me. I turned on the brass lamp on the desk, its shade still tilted from the last time Thomas used it. Light spilled across stacks of folders, boxes labeled with my handwriting from decades ago, and rolls of yellowing blueprints tied with string. I sat down heavily in the old leather chair, its springs groaning under me, and let my hand rest on a folder marked 1974 Route Expansion Project. The ink was fading, but I could still see my younger self in that label. Diligent, hopeful, determined. Something inside me stirred. I pulled the drawer open, dust rising as though the past had been holding its breath. Inside were file after file of my work. Blueprints, sketches, survey maps. Routes I'd designed through marshland, over river crossings, across mountain ridges. Each line was more than ink. They were veins of possibility, arteries of industry. And then, tucked between two thick binders, I found a folder thicker than the rest. It was stamped with a government seal and the word patents. I opened it carefully, my hands suddenly steadier than they'd been in weeks. There they were. Pages of documents bearing my name. Patents I had filed in the 1970s for unique surveying methods, for innovative bridge supports, for right-of-way strategies on routes that had once been considered too costly or complex. Some were technical, full of numbers and equations that only engineers would love. But others were maps. I spread them across the desk. Bold lines cutting across states. Routes I had helped secure rights to before corporations even thought to build there. Paths through farmland, mountain passes, and coastal areas. Many of those lines had become the backbone of freight corridors still in use today. And, I realized with a jolt, many of those patents were still active. The air in the room grew heavy as the truth settled on me. My so-called passive shares meant nothing if the very heart of the company, the routes, the rights, the patents were still tied to my name. Without these, Walker Rail couldn't legally operate. Without my signatures, those trains couldn't run, those profits couldn't flow. I sat back in the chair, the lamp flickering slightly as if it understood the shift in the air. For the first time since that cursed letter arrived, I felt something other than grief or shock. I felt power. Thomas had always teased me about keeping everything. One day our attic will collapse under the weight of your files, he'd say, shaking his head with that patient smile. I just laugh and reply, engineers don't throw away maps. The past always finds a way to be useful again. Lord, how right I had been. I spent the next 2 days in that library, sorting through stacks, reading line after line until my eyes blurred. Some of the patents had expired, true, but enough remained. Enough to matter. Enough to mean millions in revenue for the company. Enough to mean leverage for me. I pulled out an old drafting table Thomas had bought me as a gift when I turned 40. Its surface was scarred with years of use, but it was steady still. I laid the maps across it, weighting the corners with books. Then with a fresh pen I began marking them, circles, notes, arrows, connecting past to present, proving the threads of ownership that ran from 1974 straight into today's profits. At one point I stopped and laughed out loud. The sound startled me. It had been so long since I'd heard my own laughter fill that room. I laughed because I realized my grandchildren had thought me weak, outdated, irrelevant. But they had forgotten. I had built the bones of this company. And bones don't crumble easily. That night, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table surrounded by my archives. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt like myself again. The woman who had once stomped through swamps with a tripod taller than her. Who had refused to bow to any man telling her she couldn't build railways. I whispered to the room. You picked the wrong grandmother to underestimate. By dawn, my desk was covered in neatly sorted piles, labeled and dated. I knew what I had to do next. Find a lawyer sharp enough to see what I had uncovered, brave enough to stand with me when the truth came to light. I brushed the dust off my hands, folded the first patent back into its folder, and smiled. The grandchildren thought they had taken everything. But in the quiet of my old library, I had found the one thing they hadn't counted on: a second chance. The folder sat heavy in my lap the next morning as I rode into town. I hadn't been to a lawyer's office in years, not since Thomas passed. Back then I walked in with grief pressing on my shoulders, barely able to sign my own name. This time was different. This time I carried my own kind of ammunition. The office smelled of coffee and copier ink, the air humming with the low murmur of phones. My lawyer, Mr. Harrington, had a shock of white hair and eyes as sharp as a crow's. He'd handled Thomas's estate, and though I'd always thought of him as a cautious man, something about the weight of my folders made his brow furrow with interest. "What have you brought me, Mrs. Walker?" he asked, pulling his glasses down. I spread the papers across his polished desk: maps, patents, technical notes, letters from the Department of Transportation dated decades back. For a moment he just stared. Then he picked one up, adjusted his glasses, and read silently, lips pursed. "This," he finally said, tapping one patent with his pen, "is still active. Good heavens, I didn't realize you'd filed these personally." I nodded, my voice steady. "Every one of them bears my name. I designed the routes, secured the rights of way, engineered the crossings. They're mine." He leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. "Do you know what this means?" I thought I did, but hearing it aloud was different. "Mrs. Walker," he said slowly, "these aren't relics. These are the backbone of the company's current revenue. The most profitable lines, freight corridors, coastal connectors, mountain routes, are all still under the protection of your patents. Without your signatures and rights, those lines can't legally operate." I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap. I felt the air shift around me. "So all their talk of bankruptcy?" He nodded grimly. "Nonsense. Pure theater. They can't declare bankruptcy while these patents hold. In fact, the company's profits, millions upon millions each quarter, depend entirely on your intellectual property. Without you, Walker Rail collapses." The room seemed to tilt. I thought of Gregory's slick grin, of Emily's soft voice urging me to sign. They hadn't just tricked me out of shares. They had tried to cut me out of the very foundation I had laid. Mr. Harrington gathered the papers into neat stacks. "With your permission, I'll have a team audit the company's filings. We'll cross-check revenues with these patents. If I'm right, and I am, this will prove that you, not the board, hold the keys. And if your grandchildren filed bankruptcy under false pretenses while concealing these assets..." He paused, his eyes gleaming. "Well, that's fraud. Fraud." There was that word again, sharper now, heavier. I left his office with the folders carefully tucked under my arm, but my step was lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time since Thomas's death, I didn't feel like a widow shuffling through shadows. I felt like an engineer again, blueprint in hand, charting a course no one else could see. That night, I spread the maps across my dining room table. The table that had once held birthday cakes and Christmas turkeys now carried the weight of my future. I traced the lines with my finger, whispering the names of towns I'd helped connect decades ago. Each one a promise. Each one a profit stream. Each one proof that my life's work had not been erased. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Mr. Harrington called. His voice was brisk, urgent. "You were right, Mrs. Walker. The patents are still active, and the royalties from them account for nearly 60% of the company's profits. Your grandchildren didn't just mislead you. They attempted to defraud the courts by hiding these assets. That makes their bankruptcy filing not only invalid but criminal." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. 60%. More than half the company's wealth rested on my shoulders. and they thought I was powerless. I thought of Thomas again, his steady hands balancing ledgers, his quiet faith in me. "You be proud of me, love," I whispered into the silence. "You always said the numbers never lie. And here they are on my side." The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and signatures, Mr. Harrington moving with the precision of a surgeon. Every paper I had saved, every map, every patent number was catalogued and filed. Each one was a nail in the coffin of my grandchildren's scheme. But more than that, each one was a reminder that I had not wasted my life in blueprints and calculations. My work had endured. It had outlasted time, grief, even betrayal. And now it was my shield. One evening, as I packed away another stack of documents, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment, I didn't see the widow hunched under the weight of betrayal. I saw the young woman in a hard hat, boots caked in mud, eyes bright with determination. She was still in me. She always had been. And she was ready for a fight. The morning I decided to act, the sun was just breaking over the rooftops, painting the world in that soft golden light that always reminded me of train headlights at dawn. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table surrounded by stacks of patents and maps, and said aloud, "Enough." For weeks I had been pushed into silence, letters freezing my accounts, polite voices dismissing me, my own family trying to write me out of my life's work. But I wasn't built for silence. I was built for bridges and routes, for steel and grit. And if they thought I would go quietly, they had forgotten who I was. The first call I made was not to Gregory, not to Emily, not even to the company. It was to the Federal Transportation Agency. The woman who answered sounded young, her voice brisk and official. I explained who I was, gave my credentials, and told her plainly, "I believe fraud has been committed in connection with Walker Rail Holdings. I have documentation that their most profitable routes and patents remain under my ownership. Yet they filed for bankruptcy without disclosing this information." There was a pause. Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. Then her tone shifted from dismissive to alert. "Mrs. Walker, could you come in and present this documentation?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And I won't be coming alone." By the next morning, I was seated in a stark government office, my lawyer beside me, a stack of folders taller than the water pitcher on the table. Across from us sat 3 agency officials, suits crisp, eyes sharp. I laid out my life's work before them, blueprints, patent certificates, letters with government seals. I traced the routes with my finger as though I were back in my drafting days, showing them how every profitable mile of track bled back to my signature. One of the men leaned back in his chair, whistling low. "If this is accurate," he said, "your grandchildren concealed vital assets from the court. That's not just corporate mismanagement. That's forgery, possibly criminal conspiracy." I didn't flinch. I simply said, "They underestimated me." For hours I answered questions, explained technical details, gave dates and figures. My lawyer filled in the legal framework, citing statutes I barely remembered. But through it all I felt strong, almost exhilarated. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was in daylight. At the end of the meeting, the officials promised a full investigation. "Mrs. Walker," one said, looking me square in the eye, "thank you for bringing this forward. You've not only protected your own rights, you may have just prevented a serious breach of public trust." I left the office with my head high. The city air smelled of exhaust and fried food, but to me it was the cleanest air I'd breathed in months. Of course, I didn't stop there. That evening I drafted a letter, firm, detailed, unflinching, to the board of Walker Rail Holdings. I informed them that I had presented evidence of concealed assets to federal authorities, that the patents in question were mine, and that any attempt to proceed with bankruptcy would be challenged as fraudulent. I closed with one line Thomas would have loved: "Trains don't run without tracks, and these tracks belong to me." I mailed copies by certified post to every board member, every executive, every lawyer whose name I could find. I wanted no excuses, no denials. Let them all know the grandmother they tried to outwit was standing tall with the law on her side. The days that followed were a storm. Gregory called at last, his voice tight with anger. "Grandma, what have you done? You're ruining everything." "No," I said calmly. "I'm saving everything. For the company. For the workers. For the truth." Emily texted me paragraphs, half pleas, half threats. "We were trying to protect you. You don't understand modern business. You'll regret this." But I didn't regret a thing. The agency called again, requesting more documents. Reporters began leaving messages on my machine. My quiet house buzzed with the kind of energy I hadn't felt since my engineering days. An urgency, a purpose. I was no longer a passive shareholder. I was a fighter again. One night, sitting by the lamp with papers spread around me, I thought of Thomas. I could almost hear his voice, steady and warm. "You always did have more grit than steel, my love." I smiled, touching the edge of his old briefcase. "You were right, Thomas. And they're about to find out." The counterattack had begun, and I wasn't just holding ground. I was moving forward, mile by mile, like a train that had finally found its track again. It started with a phone call I didn't answer. The machine picked up while I was in the kitchen stirring soup. "Mrs. Walker, this is Angela Carter with the Tribune. We'd like to speak with you regarding Walker Rail Holdings." I froze mid-stir, spoon hovering in the air. Reporters. Lord help me. I knew then that the quiet battle behind closed doors was over. The story had leaked. By the next morning, the paper was on my porch. The headline stretched across the front page like a wound. "Elderly shareholder tricked, but she holds the key to strategic transportation." There was my name in print, my age, even an old photograph of me from a company banquet in the 1980s. Hair darker, eyes brighter, a hint of pride in my smile. I stared at that younger version of myself, coffee growing cold in my hands. The article laid it all out. How my grandchildren had persuaded me to sign away rights under false pretenses. How they had filed bankruptcy papers while concealing patents and routes tied to my name. How the federal agency was now investigating. The phone rang all day. Neighbors. Old colleagues. Even women from my bridge group who hadn't called in months. "We saw you in the paper," they said. Some voices were sympathetic, some curious, some tinged with the sharp scent of gossip. But the calls that shook me most were from men I hadn't spoken to in decades. Former engineers, union reps, even a retired conductor from Illinois. "We remember you," one said, his voice thick with age. "We remember the work you did. Don't let them steal it." For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. By the end of the week, television vans were parked on my street. Reporters stood in the drizzle with umbrellas, pointing microphones at my house. One even caught me on my way to get the mail. "Mrs. Walker, how does it feel to be betrayed by your own family?" I didn't answer. Not then. I just lifted my chin, walked back inside, and closed the door softly. But inside I burned. Gregory and Emily weren't quiet either. They held a press conference, standing side by side in suits too polished for sincerity. Gregory claimed, "Our grandmother is confused. These patents are outdated. We were only trying to protect her from financial mismanagement." Emily nodded along, her face a picture of pity. Confused. The word stuck in my ribs like a shard of glass. That evening, the Tribune ran another story. This time they printed side-by-side images, Gregory with his slick grin and me, standing in front of a spread of my maps at the federal office, pointing to a route with my pen. The caption read, "She designed the tracks that keep America moving." I'll admit, seeing that stirred something fierce in me. For years I've been treated like a relic, a grandmother tucked in the corner with her knitting. But here I was again, an engineer, my work recognized as vital. Not just nostalgia, necessity. The court battle came next. I walked into that courthouse with my lawyer, my back straight, my papers clutched in my hands. The gallery was packed, reporters, spectators, even former colleagues who had come to watch. Gregory and Emily sat at the front with their attorneys, avoiding my eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I stood. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I went on. I told the court about my career, about the patents, about the signatures that bore my name. I explained how those lines on paper weren't just technicalities, they were the very arteries of the company. At one point, I caught Gregory smirking, whispering to his lawyer. I fixed my eyes on him and said, clear as a whistle, "You thought I was too old to fight. But trains don't move without tracks, and these tracks are mine." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused, his pen hovering above the page. The trial stretched on, but outside the courthouse the story only grew. Headlines screamed of greed and betrayal, of grandchildren who sold their loyalty for bribes. Late-night hosts joked about the grandma who derailed her family. Social media flooded with strangers calling me a hero, a symbol of grit. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, worn, betrayed in the deepest way a woman can be, by the blood she had cradled in her arms as babies. But beneath the weariness I felt steel. Every night I returned to my quiet house, the phone still ringing, the reporters still waiting. I would sit by the lamp with Thomas's old briefcase beside me, my hand resting on it like a promise. I wasn't fighting for glory or headlines. I was fighting for him, for the work we both believed in, for the girl I once was who refused to be erased. The scandal had made me public, yes. But beneath the noise, it had also reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten. I wasn't done yet. The courthouse was buzzing that morning, louder than usual. Reporters jostled outside the doors, cameras flashing, their questions slicing through the crisp autumn air. I'd grown used to it by then. The microphones shoved in my face, the shouts of Grandma Walker. "How do you feel about the betrayal?" But something about that day felt different. The whispers carried a new weight. Inside, my lawyer leaned close. "We've uncovered something, Mrs. Walker. It's going to hit them hard." I braced myself. The government's investigation had been moving quietly behind the scenes, gathering documents, emails, bank statements. What they found cracked the case wide open. Gregory and Emily hadn't just tricked me into signing those papers. They had been on the take, accepting bribes from competitors who wanted Walker Rail dismantled. The plan was simple if cruel. My grandchildren had conspired with a development firm to push the company into bankruptcy. Once broken up, the land along the rail corridors would be sold off to developers for shopping malls and condos. The competitors would pay handsomely, and Gregory and Emily would get their cut. It wasn't just greed. It was treachery. When the evidence was presented in court, the room grew still. A projector flickered to life, casting emails onto the wall. Messages from Gregory to a man named Hollister, an executive at the rival firm. "Once the patents are neutralized, you'll have your access. The old woman won't know what hit her." Another from Emily. "We can finalize once the court declares insolvency. Our shares will be protected. We'll ensure she doesn't fight it." The words burned in my chest. The old woman. That's what I was to them. Not grandmother. Not family. Just an obstacle. The judge's face was carved from stone as the evidence piled up. Bank transfers. Meetings in quiet restaurants. Notes scribbled in the margins of contracts. Piece by piece, the scheme unfolded like a rotten flower. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap. Outside, cameras would soon be flashing, headlines would scream. But in that moment it was just me, my grandchildren, and the truth hanging heavy in the air. Gregory shifted in his seat, his slick confidence melting. Emily dabbed at her eyes, though no tears came. Their lawyers stammered, objected, tried to dismiss the evidence as taken out of context. But the truth was too loud now to be silenced. During recess, I stepped outside into the corridor. A reporter caught my eye and asked, "Mrs. Walker, do you have anything to say to your grandchildren?" I paused. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, the hum of voices echoing. For a long moment I thought of Gregory as a boy, tugging at my sleeve to show me the model trains he'd built on the living room floor. I thought of Emily sitting at my kitchen table coloring while I baked cookies. Children once sweet and trusting. Children I had loved. Then I said, softly but firmly, "Some debts can't be repaid. And some betrayals can't be undone." The clip aired that evening on every station. By the next day, public opinion had shifted entirely. The newspapers no longer called me confused or frail. Now I was the wronged matriarch, the keeper of the rails, the woman who had stood tall against betrayal. Gregory and Emily, meanwhile, were branded as traitors. The late-night comedians tore into them mercilessly. Social media flooded with words like greedy, ungrateful, and corrupt. But the worst blow wasn't the ridicule. It was the investigation's conclusion. Gregory and Emily had taken money directly from Walker Rail's fiercest competitors, in exchange for dismantling the company their grandfather had once believed in. It was never about helping me. It was never even about control. It was about selling our family's legacy to the highest bidder. When this truth was read aloud in court, I felt something inside me harden. The grief I'd carried since the day I signed those papers shifted into something sharper. Not just sorrow but resolve. I leaned toward my lawyer and whispered, "We're not just fighting for my rights anymore. We're fighting for the company, for every worker who depends on these tracks, for every town that would be gutted if they got their way." He nodded, his eyes steady. "And you're winning." Outside the courthouse that afternoon, the reporters swarmed again. Their questions came fast, urgent, almost breathless. "Mrs. Walker, what do you think of the bribery evidence? Do you believe your grandchildren should face criminal charges?" I didn't answer directly. I simply said, "The truth has a way of catching up, and today it has." The cameras clicked, the crowd murmured, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. Because I knew Thomas would have wanted me to see it through, to defend not just myself but the rails we both believed in. That night I sat alone in the library, the lamp casting warm light over the spread of maps. I traced the lines again, not with worry this time but with pride. My work had stood strong. My name had endured. And the lies that sought to bury it were crumbling under their own weight. The blow had landed not on me but on the ones who thought me too weak to fight back. And oh, how it shook them. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper that morning, like it always did. But the air felt different, charged, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I sat on the wooden bench, my lawyer beside me, folders neatly stacked in front of us, though by now every soul in that room knew what they contained. The judge shuffled his papers, lifted his gaze, and began to speak. "I've been in a lot of meetings in my life, project reviews, union debates, negotiations over contracts, but nothing compared to that moment." My heart thudded in my chest with each word, slow and steady like the beat of a train engine on the rails. "The court finds," the judge began, "that the bankruptcy filings submitted on behalf of Walker Rail Holdings were fraudulent. Material assets, including patents and intellectual property tied directly to Mrs. Evelyn Walker, were knowingly concealed. All such filings are hereby declared invalid." There it was. Plain, unshakable. Fraud. Invalid. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let the words sink into my bones. Months of betrayal, of being dismissed, of my own grandchildren calling me confused, all undone in a single sentence. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court recognizes that the patents in question constitute the majority of the company's revenue streams. Given this, Mrs. Walker's stake is not only preserved but elevated. Effective immediately, she holds controlling interest in Walker Rail Holdings. Controlling interest? I thought I might get my stake back. I'd prayed I wouldn't lose what Thomas had entrusted to me. But to gain control? That was more than victory. That was vindication. Around me the courtroom buzzed. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, lawyers whispered. Gregory sat stiff in his chair, his face drained of color, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack. Emily leaned forward, burying her face in her hands. Their lawyers shuffled papers like soldiers retreating from a lost battle. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply sat still, hands folded, and let the relief wash through me like a tide. When the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end, the room erupted. Reporters surged forward, questions flying like arrows. My lawyer shielded me as best he could, but microphones still pressed close. Mrs. Walker, how does it feel to take control? Do you plan to remove your grandchildren from the company entirely? What will happen to Walker Rail now? I lifted my chin and said just one thing. The trains will keep running. That's what matters. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were blinding. People clapped as I walked down the steps. Some were strangers, some were retired railway workers who'd come just to see me stand tall. One man pressed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for fighting for us." I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. Back home that evening, the house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I set Thomas's old briefcase on the table and placed my hand on it. "We did it," I whispered into the stillness. "We didn't just survive, we won." The next morning, the headlines screamed of it. Grandmother defeats family in rail battle. Now holds reins of company. Walker legacy preserved by matriarch's victory. The story spread faster than I could keep track. Old colleagues called. A senator's office reached out. Even the mayor sent a letter of congratulations. But none of it meant as much to me as the quiet knowledge that I had honored Thomas's faith. He had trusted me with his legacy, and I had carried it, even when my own kin tried to take it away. Of course, victory wasn't just about me. The workers of Walker Rail, thousands of men and women who depended on those routes, would keep their jobs. The trains would keep running, the freight would keep moving. The towns along the lines would keep their lifeblood. That mattered most. As for Gregory and Emily, well, the blow was heavy. The federal investigation wasn't finished with them. The evidence of bribery meant they weren't just losing their stake. They were facing charges. I heard their lawyers were already scrambling to cut deals. Broke my heart in a way. I had once held them as babies, soothed their cries, baked them birthday cakes. To see them fall so far was a grief all its own. But choices carry weight, and they had chosen greed over love, betrayal over loyalty. And the law, unlike family, doesn't forgive. That night I sat in my library again, the patents neatly stacked, the maps spread out like old friends. I lit the brass lamp and poured myself a small glass of wine. I raised it to the empty chair across from me. "To you, Thomas," I whispered. "We built these rails together, and they're still ours. Still strong. Still carrying the weight of a nation." The house was quiet, but in that moment, I swear I heard the distant echo of a train whistle, long and low, rolling across the years. Victory was mine. But more than that, justice had been served. And I knew deep in my bones that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. I thought victory in court would be the end of it. I imagined I'd slip back into my quiet routines. Gardening, reading, perhaps a little bridge with the ladies down the street. But life, it seems, had other plans. A week after the ruling, a letter arrived. Not from lawyers, not from the bank, but from Washington. The U.S. Department of Transportation wanted to meet. At first, I thought it was just formality, a polite acknowledgement of the trial's outcome. But when I sat in that tall building with its marble halls and polished floors, I realized they weren't just congratulating me. They wanted to partner with me. Mrs. Walker, the undersecretary said, sliding a folder across the table, your patents and routes are strategically critical. America's rail system is aging and your vision, your work is precisely what we need. We'd like to contract with you to modernize key corridors. I blinked, hands folded in my lap. 73 years old, a widow with silver hair and stiff knees, and here they were asking me to help shape the future of American transportation. I thought of Thomas again, of the girl I once was sketching tracks in the dirt. I thought of every man who told me women had no place in engineering, of every dismissal, every underestimation. And then I thought of my grandchildren who tried to erase me with a signature. I smiled, steady and sure. Yes, let's build something worth leaving behind. And just like that, instead of bankruptcy, I became a state partner, one of the most influential women in transportation. Reporters now called me the Iron Matriarch, a title that made me laugh. All I had really done was hold on to the truth. But maybe that's the secret, sweetheart. Life will try to push you off the tracks. People, even family, may betray you. But if you stand firm, if you hold fast to what you know is right, the rails will carry you forward. I'm not just a grandmother anymore. I'm an engineer again. And the trains, well, they're still running. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.